Hello and welcome to Regional Roundtable. I'm Will Stewart, President of the Greater Derry Londonderry Chamber of Commerce and your host. Regional Roundtable is a program of the Greater Derry Londonderry Chamber of Commerce aimed at discussing regions or issues of regional importance. Our guest today is Robert Tourigny, Executive Director of NeighborWorks Southern New Hampshire. Welcome.
Thanks, Will.
Well, why don't we jump right in here? Perhaps we can start off, just tell me a little bit about yourself and NeighborWorks Southern New Hampshire.
Sure. NeighborWorks is a nonprofit community development organization. We've been around for about 22 years, and our primary focus is really around creating affordable housing opportunities for folks. We sort of have two programs. We work on the affordable housing development side of things, where we actually create housing opportunities and apartments and homes for folks. And then on the other side of things is really about education for the consumer and helping people become better homeowners by providing education, one-on-one counseling, so that they can make good, informed decisions about purchasing and owning a home.
Excellent. I know there's seems to be a lot of confusion, at least that's my perception, on the terms workforce housing and affordable housing.
Sure.
Can you help maybe kind of clarify what those two terms mean? Are they the same thing? What does it mean? What don't they mean?
Sure. I mean, affordable housing is just housing that people can afford. And sort of the rule of thumb is if you're spending more than 30% of your income for your housing costs, then you're paying too much for housing. And so a few years ago, someone coined the term workforce housing, which really was, I think, a way of identifying or labeling housing that's affordable to the local workforce, so that people working in that area or that region shouldn't really have to pay more than 30% of their income towards their housing expenses or their housing costs. And so it was just a sort of a catch-all phrase, I think, that was developed to capture that title. But 30, 40, 50 years ago, people really didn't think about that. There were homes that people could afford, and there were homes that people couldn't afford. And so what's really developed is the name workforce housing, just to sort of capture that name of what housing opportunities are affordable to the local workforce.
So I guess that kind of leads into my next question. And given that workforce is half of that term, what is the relationship between where someone works and where they live?
Well, that's, I think, what's evolved over time is through land use decisions and zoning and planning, and it's sort of crafted a way that it's puts people that can afford to own a home in one part of the town and people that can't afford to own a home in another part of the town or a town that's much further away. And so it really, if someone may work in a town, they might not actually be able to afford to live in that town. And so that's where I think the term workforce housing came from, is to mean that if someone's going to work in that community, then they should be able to afford to live in that community and have a direct correlation. And that's what contributes to things that people don't like, which is traffic and congestion and school crowding and all that other stuff. So when it comes to being able to develop a plan for a community and meet the needs of the workforce in that community, it's important to have a percentage of the housing inventory that's affordable to the people in that community.
And what do you see here in this region with regard to that type of maybe ideal kind of dynamic or proportion?
Sure, it's hard to define it as a regional issue, because everything is based so much on the individual towns. The zoning and land use decisions are all based by municipality. And so the affordability and the housing inventory can vary pretty widely from town to town, just from two neighboring towns. So it's interesting because, New Hampshire, what happens in southern New Hampshire is very different than what happens in Coos County. And the same could be said true in a much smaller regional area from Manchester to Nashua and the towns in between and the towns going east and west. So it varies quite a bit.
Now, I recall hearing a planning board official, I believe it was a planning or zoning board official in a nearby town, not in this great region, but nearby, that once referred to. They said, "Well, we don't need affordable or workforce housing in our town. That's what Manchester is for."
Mm-hmm.
Is there really a need for this type of workforce housing in the smaller communities of our region?
There absolutely is. It's important to help educate planning board members and folks that are on town councils and all those different groups that make those types of decisions, because that's sort of the stereotypical attitude, is that yeah, there are some towns that are more affordable, and that's where, if you can't afford to live here, that's where people should live. But it doesn't create for a good balance for the economy of that municipality or that town. I mean, people oftentimes forget to think about where the store clerk that just sold them that cup of coffee needs to live. You know, if they can't afford to live in that town and they have to live, 30 miles away because there's nothing in that community that's affordable to them either to own or to rent, then that contributes to greater problems throughout the community. Like I mentioned, traffic and congestion and all that other stuff.
Well, I know in my role as the president of the Chamber of Commerce, I've talked with some business owners, excuse me, who say that the longer commute that somebody has, the higher likelihood of their turning over. And so if they're constantly having to hire new employees because their employees can't afford to live nearby, that's a business issue for them, and it's a personnel issue.
Sure. And commuting costs associated with it. I mean, we've been fortunate the last few months that gas prices have been down, but a year ago, it cost a lot of money to fill up your tank. And so, if you're making, the average wage, not a real high wage, and you're having to put all that money into your gas tank, you can't afford to spend that on rent in that particular town that you might be working in. So you end up having to live much further away. So it's really a difficult balance for some households to be able to maintain.
I would also add too, from the kind of the business standpoint, it's if you're spending greater than 30% or 40, 50, 60, some people spend upwards of on their housing cost. That's less money that you're able to spend at the local diner, buying a cup of coffee on your way to work, or going out to eat, or buying a shirt at a local retail shop perhaps. So
it's exactly right. I say 30% of income because that's been the rule of thumb for a long time, and I think it's an important number to use. We consider people to be housing burdened if they're having to spend more than 30% of their income on either their rent or their mortgage payment. And so it's surprising when you look at the workforce that's in the retail sectors and in the service sectors, how high a percentage they are having to pay to maintain a rent that's affordable to them around this region.
In our kind of consumer spending based economy, that's like you're in real trouble. The less people have, the less money is flowing freely.
Absolutely, that's exactly right.
So speaking of people who are earning that average wage, whether it's or less than the average wage, any idea what the proportion is in this region, or at least the region that you cover, that people are, what they're making and kind of their relationship on what they're spending?
Well, we use what's known as the area median income for determining what households can fall under the workforce housing definition. And so, in this area, it's a household that's earning, $45,000 to $50,000 a year. It is based on family size. Mm-hmm. And so you can imagine if they're spending that much, if they're earning that much, they really shouldn't be spending more than about $1,100 or $1,200 a month for housing costs. And if they're having to spend much more than that, then that really limits them as to what they can be able to spend on other things. And like you said, vehicles and other expenses that they might incur around the community. Certainly leaving out the opportunity to go out to dinner and dine at the local restaurants. Mm-hmm.
So just to clarify, when you say housing cost, what all does that include? Rent and what else?
Typically includes the rent and the heat,
mm-hmm.
the cost to heat a rental unit. And on the home ownership side, it's usually the mortgage payment, which includes the principal and interest, and then the local taxes and the insurance. So the PITI, the principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, that total monthly housing cost shouldn't really exceed 30% of the household's income.
Okay. Now I know your organization has really evolved, over the past 20 plus years now.
Yes.
Started out as Manchester Neighborhood Housing Services, then went to NeighborWorks Greater Manchester, and now you're NeighborWorks Southern New Hampshire. What's kind of been the impetus of your the growth of your organization and your organization's kind of catchment area?
Sure. It has been an interesting timeline. We really started out to be primarily focused on neighborhood development and revitalization in the center city of Manchester, and really with a firm belief that neighborhoods need homeowners. And so we've put a lot of effort into converting homes in the city of Manchester that were once rentals into places where people can own and live in a unit and maybe rent out another unit. But as times changed, market conditions changed, the population has changed, we've had to grow too. And so we've grown from a citywide organization to a regional-wide organization to really help address the housing needs across the region. And so the housing needs in some of the surrounding communities are very different than the housing needs in some of the inner city areas that we've worked. And so in a smaller, more suburban town, the housing needs could be creating new housing opportunities in a community that's primarily made up of single-family homes, because that's what the zoning has allowed and what the demand has been for. It's left very few opportunities for new affordable rental opportunities, rental housing units. And so we've recently been able to embark on a new rental project in the town of Londonderry that will help to address some of those needs.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about the project you're undertaking there.
Yes, we're currently working on a project located on Mast Road in Londonderry. It was formally approved to be a senior housing project, age-restricted condo development, and we worked with the town to change the approvals to allow for the development of 78 townhouses. And so we presently have under construction 45 units that should be done hopefully around mid-July, depending on the weather and how quickly things thaw out. But we'll be developing 45 townhouses that will all be available for rent. And there'll be 2 and 3 bedroom units. So it's very new to the market. There was not a lot of rental inventory in Londonderry. And so we're quite anxious to get that up and running and see how that goes.
Now you mentioned that they're townhouses. I think one of the things that I hear is that when people hear affordable or workforce housing, I think they're envisioning something else.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Towers perhaps that you see maybe in Boston or the Marcy Garden in New York or places like that.
Right.
This sounds a pretty far cry from that.
It really is. I mean, we're a housing developer, but we're also a community builder, and so it's not our objective. It's not our objective to go into a community and build something that nobody wants. I mean, if we're developing affordable housing in a community, it's because there's a need and people want it, and so we want a place that people are proud of and want to live there, and so. We've been successful in several towns around the region in developing affordable units, and typically that townhouse style unit it works very well for us. They may be renters, but they take a lot of pride in the unit that they're living in, and it's a good stepping stone to someday move on and be able to own a home. And we consider that starter place for a lot of folks. Now,
you mentioned kind of the things that are in place or out of place in a particular town, and residents have concerns. And one of the concerns I most hear is, they'll say, workforce housing or affordable housing is quote unquote out of character, with our community or the character of our town. Is that a fair concern? Is that something that you take into mind? What's your reaction to that?
We certainly do take it into mind. I mean, it's somebody's neighborhood, and we don't want to change the neighborhood to make it worse. We want to improve the neighborhood and provide value to the neighborhood. We've had projects in the city of Manchester where we've done huge improvements to older, dilapidated buildings, and it's made a remarkable impact on the neighborhood. On the other side of things, we've developed new affordable housing that people were quite surprised to see happen. I mean, in the town of Amherst, in a historic district, we were able to build 28 townhouse units that are all available for rent, but when you drive by, you really wouldn't know that there's that many apartments in there because they look like big old colonial homes, and they just happen to be townhouses inside of buildings. And so there's different ways of integrating it into the development scheme, and it really comes back to what sort of zoning ordinances and land use plans the local jurisdiction has to allow that sort of development to take place.
Well, I know Londonderry now is Whittemore Place is just, I think, one of several projects under development now. How is Londonderry doing with regard to, kind of their workforce or land planning, land use allowances?
I think I've been involved with the town of Londonderry for about 9 years in different iterations over time. Because they established a workforce housing task force many years ago to look at the issue, because folks in town recognized that there was a need for affordable housing. They recognized that it was a challenge. As a for-profit builder, it's really difficult to just go into a town and buy a piece of land and build something that's affordable. The numbers just don't work. If they did, everybody would be doing it. Sure. And so it was a good opportunity for us to work hand in hand with the town, work with the task force, and actually develop an ordinance for the town to have in place that enabled certain parcels of land to be able to be developed under the affordable housing statute. And so it's difficult when you go into a town that is predominantly built out. It's difficult to go into a town that doesn't have a lot of infrastructure. But if you have density and you have water and you have sewer, then you have the basics for being able to pull something like that off. And so, so we were able to work with the town of Londonderry, the planning board, and thanks to the folks on that housing task force many years ago, really planting the seed and laying the groundwork for that to all happen. And I think there's currently the planning staff there now, the planning board there now is working on some updates and revisions to their zoning ordinance as well, because they have seen a lot of demand from other developers, I think.
I recall reading in the Londonderry Times a couple of weeks ago, one of the town councilors, or maybe it was a planning board member, mentioned Whittemore Place in particular, NeighborWorks, as being kind of a model of what they would like to see it look like. That's pretty high praise, I think. That's
a feather in our hat. We're very proud of comments like that, because it wasn't that many years ago where people didn't know what to expect. And so step by step, we've been able to lay some groundwork in several communities that we're quite proud of the work that we've done. And the families that live there certainly appreciate it, and no complaints from the town. So that's, in the end, that's what it's all about.
That's great. And I mean, you mentioned Amherst doing a project townhouse development there. You've also done similar developments in other communities. What other communities have you done work in outside of Manchester?
Sure. Our first project outside of Manchester was in the town of Goffstown, which was a nice infill project in an area where there's grocery stores and all kinds of other things, amenities. And so from there, we were able to move into the town of Hooksett and do another infill project as well in the town of Hooksett. And it was great to be able to point to that first project and say, this is exactly what it's going to look like, and take the sort of the mystery out of it, and that perception and that stereotypical idea that you mentioned earlier that a lot of folks have just because they aren't familiar with it.
But once they can see it, it alleviates a lot of those concerns, I think.
It really does. And I've had abutters in one town during the hearing process say, I went and looked at the property that you did in that other town, and I drove around it and looked at it, and it's nice and clean and it's well kept, and you have my support. So
that's great.
That's really the best feedback and results that we can get.
Well, you mentioned as well the types of people who we kind of these projects kind of cater to. Can you talk a little bit about with Whittemore Place and Londonderry in particular, but really generally speaking, who lives in these types of developments? What types of people live there? What do they do?
It's the everyday folks that you encounter all day long, walking into town halls, retail stores, businesses. You go to the dentist and there's a hygienist there, or there's someone taking your appointment or checking you in. It's folks that work in the community that really oftentimes don't have a choice about where they can live because of affordability challenges. It's a very expensive region, and unfortunately, sometimes people have to live further and further away or double up. And so, what we can provide is a place for folks who work in the community to be able to stay in the community, and it covers all aspects of the workforce, everything from, like I mentioned, retail to folks that work in town hall to folks that work in all the businesses that you could possibly think of. In that income bracket that I mentioned earlier. So,
you mentioned that it's often difficult for, say, a for-profit developer to go into a lot of towns and be able to, with lack of density perhaps and other kind of infrastructure issues, to be able to, the numbers don't work.
Right.
You said. So how is NeighborWorks able to do it?
We actually have to compete quite hard for financing to be able to do projects like this. It really does take a lot of effort to make sure that you lay the groundwork in having enough density to make it work, adequate infrastructure. It helps to be on natural gas, and we've been very fortunate to have infrastructure to help keep those operating costs down over the long haul on the utility side. But the real challenging piece for us as a developer is to compete for the financing. As you can imagine, with a need all across the state in various markets from the seacoast to the Upper Valley, the availability of resources to develop projects like this is very scarce. And so we end up having to compete with other developers for tax credits that we use to build the project that we end up selling to investors. And so that's really the main vehicle for being able to finance projects like this. But they are very, very competitive, and makes for a challenge when you're trying to do projects to meet the need in the local community when the state is trying to address needs all over the place. So,
and it's not something I imagine that takes place very quickly. What's kind of the timeline on these types of?
Like I mentioned, we've been working with the town of Londonderry for probably 7 or 8 years on the land use side. But once you've identified the site, gone through the planning approval process, and obtained the financing, it goes pretty quickly. You can build in less than a year, but it can take probably about 2 to 3 years to lay all that groundwork in a typical scenario from start to finish, to be able to get the approvals and obtain the financing and everything else. But sometimes it can go a little bit beyond that too.
And of course, Londonderry, like you said, is a town that's been pretty proactive in creating their own workforce housing task force and so forth, which kind of points back to a 2007 law that passed the legislature that, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically, in broad strokes, prohibits a town from zoning out affordable housing developments like this.
Right.
Can you explain the law a little bit and kind of what it means, particularly for the towns in our region?
Sure. It's not a law that says this is what you have to do. It's really a law that says what you cannot do. You can't zone something out because you really all the law says is you really have to just create the opportunity to allow someone to be able to develop affordable workforce housing, and that means you can't establish a zoning ordinance that's so rigid that it just makes every project unfeasible. And so I think that's what worked to the town of Londonderry's advantage by being proactive and figuring out what those needs are actually in advance of the statute coming into place. But since the law has passed, I think it's been a good learning lesson learned for a lot of communities, because I think there was a lot of resistance at first because they felt like it was the state telling them what they had to do, but it really doesn't say that they have to do anything other than just create an opportunity for a developer to come in. Under the statute, it's still incumbent upon the developer to prove the feasibility of the project. It's not the responsibility of the town to do that. So it's an opportunity for a developer to work with the municipality, to find the right project, to create the right fit, so that it's feasible for the developer. It creates an end result for the homeowner or the tenant, and it fits the needs of the town, and the town has some say in it. So far, I think it's working pretty well. There have been some good examples. The town of Windham, there's a single-family subdivision. We're working with a for-profit developer in the town of Windham to develop. It's only 3 units of affordable housing, but it's a start and it's a help, and it's beginning to scratch that surface of meeting some of the demand and some of the needs in that community.
You mentioned Windham. What's next on the horizon for NeighborWorks Southern New Hampshire? Well,
we actually, I mentioned we got 78 units approved in the town of Londonderry. We have 45 under construction because it comes back to that availability of limited resources. And so we have to compete again for another round of funding to finish the project in Londonderry. So we hopefully will be wrapping up in Londonderry around mid-July, and then next year I'll be pursuing Phase 2 in Londonderry, which would be another 33 units at the Mast Road site. And then beyond that, we're still, we're looking for opportunities. We're, as I mentioned, working with various communities, town councils, boards of selectmen, housing task forces if they have one. But, I'm always willing and interested in coming into a community to speak to the folks about the needs of their community and see if there's a way we can help address those needs.
So how can people learn more about NeighborWorks Southern New Hampshire?
Certainly, reach us on our website, which is nwsnh.org. There's a lot of information about our organization, the projects that we've done, a lot about our homeownership program as well. And if they have any questions, they can always call us at 626-4663.
Great. Well, thank you. I believe I've asked all the questions that I meant to ask today. Is there anything we're leaving out or that you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
No, this has been a great discussion. And I guess I would just summarize by saying I think it's really important for communities to have balance. And that's really all it's about. It's not about creating too much of any one thing. But, in the 40 or 50 years that we've had zoning in place, and there's been a lot of growth in Southern New Hampshire, I think towns have to start to look at things a little bit differently and make sure that they do have balance as far as jobs and housing needs, and making sure that they match up.
Indeed. good for the community and good for the business community as well.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Robert, for being our guest today on Regional Roundtable, and thank you for watching. This will be wrap up episode number 2, and look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you.